I see far too many people butcher their barbell row technique and it's keeping them small. Here's how to fix that. Welcome back, Dr. Milo Wolf here, PhD in sports science, teaching you how to improve on your barbell row technique. First up, what is technique and why does it even matter? Fortunately for you, I was the author on a recent review paper that looked at exactly this. What evidence do we have for confirming what is good technique and what is bad technique? If you go into any gym, you'll get different people giving you different advice about how to do barbell rows, whether cheating is a good thing or not. We looked at the evidence on the topic, and here's what we came up with as the most evidence-based guidelines for maximizing your muscle growth as far as your technique goes. The 3 components we could identify from the research that make up good technique for building the most muscle possible are as follows. First, we have tempo, or essentially how fast or slow you go while doing repetitions. Based on a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues, it seems like if your reps take more than about 8 seconds per rep total, including the lifting, lowering, and pausing phases, you're likely seeing less hypertrophy. Likewise, although it's less clear, if your reps are super fast, say a second or less, you're probably missing out on hypertrophy. So the pendlay row, where you have no eccentric control whatsoever, is likely a bad thing when it comes to hypertrophy. Instead, I would aim for at least a 1 to maybe 2 second eccentric on each repetition to maximize muscle building. As long as most repetitions take at least 2 seconds total, and there is some more preliminary evidence out there now suggesting that a slightly slower eccentric or lowering phase and a slightly faster concentric or lifting phase are preferable, but broadly speaking, as long as your reps take between 1 to 2 to maybe 8 seconds per repetition, you're in the right ballpark. And for bonus points, slow down your lowering phase a little bit and be explosive on the lifting phase or the concentric phase. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, if your reps take much longer than about 8 seconds per rep, which is super uncommon with barbell rows, if anything you see the opposite, just be aware that you are likely reducing hypertrophy by going that slow. The second factor we identified was external momentum generated by other joints, and this is huge when it comes to barbell rowing. Now, as you may or may not know, we don't have any studies directly looking at this, but there is a theoretical rationale for why minimizing momentum generated by other joints is a bad thing. First, it essentially reduces the likelihood of the primary agonist muscles we're trying to target, the upper back musculature, the lats, the biceps, the rear delts, being the limiting factor. For a movement or a set to be good for hypertrophy, we want to take the target muscles close to failure or even to failure. If when you're doing your barbell rows, you're suddenly involving your glutes, adductors, and hamstrings by jerking the weight out and going from really bent over to essentially upright, that is reducing the likelihood that your upper back, biceps, rear delts, etc. are going to give out first. And so while we don't have any direct evidence comparing a more body English heavy technique to a more strict technique, which by the way, we are working on, that study will be coming out in the next year or so, it is theoretically important, as we have evidence that going closer to failure for a given muscle group or a given movement does increase hypertrophy, as shown by a meta-regression by Robinson and colleagues from a year ago. So we just want to use a technique that probably minimizes the involvement of other muscle groups and maximizes the chances of the target muscles being the limiting factor. Additionally, when it comes to the barbell row, for example, turning it into a weird deadlift to row hybrid where you're suddenly using a lot of glute, adductor, and hamstrings is probably causing more fatigue for not much additional stimulus. I think we can all agree that a deadlift is more fatiguing than a barbell row, all else being equal, and so going from a strict technique where you're only moving your elbows, shoulders, shoulder blades, etc., to one where you're essentially doing a half deadlift rep is likely to cause more fatigue. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, what about the loaded stretch? If I use that technique, I can use more weight and get a better loaded stretch, which for hypertrophy, you seem to be the guy who's all about, right? Well, yeah, in isolation, using more weight and getting more weight in that loaded stretch position might increase stimulus a little bit, but there are better alternatives. And that's also where flexion rows come in, or essentially any sort of rowing variation, like a barbell row, where you intentionally flex and extend the spine. Now, because one of the bigger muscles in your back, the erector spinae, or what most people refer to as your lower back muscle, even though it goes all the way up to your neck, that muscle is responsible for spinal extension. So if we intentionally flex and extend the spine during the barbell row, or during what we call a flexion row, then that likely increases how well those muscles are being trained. I would generally reserve flexion rows for chest supported rows, where you're able to easily focus on spinal flexion and extension as opposed to just flexing and extending your hips. The other slight limitation of flexion rows for hypertrophy is I'm not too sure whether or not flexion rows take your lower back or your erector muscles particularly close to failure. At the very least, most people can deadlift and isometrically contract their erectors with way more weight than they can barbell row. And so even if you now start extending and flexing the spine during the flexion row, I'm not sure the weight being used is sufficient to really target the erector muscles that well. Instead, you may still be limited by upper back strength, which is a good thing for the upper back muscles, but it may also just make the flexion row not that great of an exercise for the erector muscles. And in general, I would rather keep your rowing exercises for your upper back and maybe some lower back isolation movements for your erector muscles. For example, many gyms have a spinal extension machine, also called a lower back extension machine. That is probably a better place to train your erector muscles than with a row, or at least do it on chest supported machine rows to make it a little bit more intuitive to flex and extend your spine as opposed to your hips. The third component of good technique is range of motion, and that's where I see a lot of people mess up their barbell row technique. The main finding within the research when it comes to range of motion is that we want to focus on the stretch position. That means at the very least using a full range of motion and not skimping on that full stretch. And additionally, there is some evidence now showing that lengthened partials, or essentially just doing half reps in the stretch position, could cause more muscle growth compared to doing a full range of motion. There's a few implications of these findings. First, doing the pendlay row, where you essentially let the weight rest on the ground on each rep, is likely not ideal. You're missing out on the full stretch of your upper back musculature and you're essentially removing tension in that position. To avoid this issue with a pendlay row or the dead stop row where you just put the weight down at the bottom, consider standing on a plate. By standing on a plate, you're able to get a full stretch in your upper back musculature, likely increasing muscle building. Second, based on a recent study I was involved in, doing some partial repetitions in the lengthened position in a movement that's hardest at the very top in a peak squeeze might cause more hypertrophy. And so in a barbell row, where the hardest part of the movement is touching your stomach, or that very contracted, shortened position for your back, when you can't get another full rep, there may be a benefit had by just doing some partials in the stretched position. In general, for every rowing exercise, or pretty much every back exercise in general, even pull downs and pull-ups, focusing a bit more on the stretch position probably makes sense. Most back movements are hardest in the shortened position. And for more hypertrophy, there's a good chance that we want to increase the emphasis on the stretch position. That could be done by doing partials after full range of motion failure. It could be done by just doing partials, but finding ways to increase the emphasis on the stretch is likely a good thing as far as your technique goes. And so when demonstrating technique to you, I'll kind of give you three options. 1, just doing a full range of motion but still focusing on the stretch. 2, doing lengthened partials. And 3, doing partials after failure. And the final component of good technique, and this is me speaking more so as a coach now than anything we identified within the paper, is preference and pain management. If you're hitting the above criteria of a good range of motion, focusing on the stretch, a good tempo, and minimizing involvement of other joints, but there's a certain technique you enjoy doing more, go for it, even if it means a slight compromise on the above factors. And the same goes for pain management. If, for example, doing your barbell rows perfectly bent over in like a RDL position causes you a little bit more lower back pain, but being a bit more upright doesn't, there's a good chance that you should just roll with whatever's less painful. Now that I've explained what makes up good technique on the barbell row, let me give you a set of instructions that you can use to optimize your barbell row technique based on the evidence. First, adopt a similar stance as you would for Romanian deadlifts. Shoulder width or narrower, feet straight ahead in all likelihood. Then grab the barbell and flex your hips as much as possible, just like you would in the bottom position of a Romanian deadlift. Avoid too much knee bend as the knees can get in the way of the barbell. Hip hinge the bar off the ground with straight arms. Congratulations! This is your starting position in the barbell row. By starting your set this way, you're making sure that you get a full stretch on each rep. Next, row the barbell up, either just past your knees for partials, giving you a heavier loaded stretch, or all the way until it touches your abdomen for full range of motion reps. Once you've reached the top of your repetition, control the bar down over at least 2 seconds. In the bottom position, in that full stretch, consider slightly pausing. Once you've paused, be as explosive as possible out of that bottom stretched position. It's always a good idea to do so because it essentially makes you generate more tension in that stretch position, but especially so with a relatively unloaded stretch like the barbell row. Throughout the whole repetition and the whole set, minimize torso movement. Common mistakes include raising your chest as you row and dropping it on the way down to meet the barbell. The only things moving should be your arms and your shoulder blades. If your hip angle changes, you're involving your glutes, adductors, and hamstrings for no good reason. I hate to break it to you, but no one's impressed with your 2 to 4 plate cheat row, bro. No one cares. Finally, when it comes to breathing, where you breathe is mostly personal preference. You might find you're strongest by breathing out freely during the lowering phase or the eccentric, and performing a Valsalva maneuver or bracing during the concentric. So that is the technique I recommend for maximizing upper back growth in the barbell row. Let's go through the technique checklist and make sure we've hit every point adequately. First, as far as tempo goes, we have a 2-second eccentric. We're not turning it into a weird deadlift row hybrid where you're just dropping the weight down. We have an explosive concentric or lifting phase. We're pausing at the very bottom in that lengthened position, and we're generally using tempo to emphasize that stretch. Next, as far as range of motion goes, the barbell row as an exercise isn't particularly lengthen biased. It's going to be most challenging in that shortened position. But using lengthened partials and modifying our technique slightly to get a full stretch and not have a dead stop at the bottom of the rep, we're increasing the focus on the stretch. If you'd like more of an emphasis on the stretch, feel free to try a prime machine row or even a chest-supported T-bar row or a T-bar row in general. And finally, we're limiting external momentum generated by non-target muscle groups. We're keeping the hips and torso static throughout the whole set. It is very easy to cheat your barbell rows, but prioritize moving only the arms and the shoulder blades, and you'll be in a really good position. That is the video. Broke down the science on how to best perform your barbell rows as far as muscle building goes. If you enjoyed the video, leave a comment, like the video, subscribe. I know like half of you aren't subscribed currently, so I'd really appreciate it if you, watching this video, would subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, go to myoadapt.com and sign up to the email newsletter. In a few months, we'll be releasing a training app that actually includes good technique instructions for all exercises. MyoAdapt is aiming to be a cutting-edge app using all of the latest scientific research to be an evidence-based coach within your pocket, giving you an individualized program to maximize muscle growth that adjusts week to week based on your feedback. We've been working on this for years and it will be releasing in just a few months. So if you're interested, go to myoadapt.com, sign up, and you'll be notified when it comes out. Oh, and did I mention it's going to be a fraction of the price of what most coaches would charge you for good evidence-based programming. I'm confident in saying there's nothing else like it out there. In the meantime, if you'd like me to coach you, consider checking out the link above and I can become your coach. If you'd like to see me break down the optimal technique for any other exercises, leave a comment down below and I'll get to it. In the meantime, have a fantastic day and I'll see you guys, my subscribers, next time. Peace.